Hi friends, Molton here and welcome back to another opening video. So it's been a while since our last video and I've been working on a couple of different opening repertoires which I'm very excited to share with you. Starting with this one which has been very popularly requested, and that's the Vienna Gambit. I'm going to cover my recommendations which I've been trying out against each of Black's most important responses. So as always, feel free to jump around using the timestamps if you wish. Otherwise, stick around and I hope you enjoy the video. I'll see you very shortly. Okay, so the Vienna starts out after e4, e5, and then white plays the move knight to c3. Here black has a couple of different responses. I'm going to start with the one which I think is going to be the most played, especially at a lower level, and that is the move knight to f6. Now white has two main options here. One is bishop c4, which leads into the Halloween Gambit, which I've covered before and it's a lot of fun. But here I'm going to recommend the move pawn to f4 for white. Now before I get to the most critical response, which is pawn to d5 here for black to challenge the center, the most popular move, especially at a lower level, is going to be twofold. One is going to be the move knight to c6, after which white should immediately just capture the pawn on e5, and after the move knight takes e5, play pawn to d4, taking space in the center and kicking black's knight away. For example, if the black knight goes back to c6, then again we will chase this knight with the move pawn to e5, and already white has a fantastic position after the move knight to f3, since we're just more developed than black is. So that is one response which is very popular. Another one is the move pawn takes on f4, which is inaccuracy, but it's seen a lot, especially at the beginner level. And after the move pawn to e5, black is in a lot of trouble because this knight doesn't have too many squares to go to. Here there are two moves which I've seen. One is the move knight to g8, after which white should just develop with knight to f3, pawn to d6. We should play the move pawn to d4, pawn takes e5, and here we emphasize the importance of development, and that we don't need to actually capture back this pawn on e5 because black will have this check on h4. Instead we just say, well, you can just take all our pawns and we're just going to put the bishop on c4. We have three pieces developed and you don't have anything out quite yet. So for example, I've had two games here I've tried out. One where opponent played the move bishop to e6, which followed bishop takes, pawn takes, and white just castled with a fantastic position here. For example, bishop d6, queen to e2, with an attack here along the e file, and black is in a lot of trouble here. Another game, more interesting one, continued. Pawn takes on d4, after which try to spot the best move for white. Again, emphasizing the fact that development is the most important thing here. We can just ignore the fact that our knight is being attacked and then just castle the king to safety. If black again is greedy and goes for all the material in the position given to him by taking the knight, then white has a fantastic move here. Bishop takes f7, a very common tactic, where if we take, the queen is hanging on the d8 square. And of course the king going to e7 doesn't help because we can play the move rook to e1, dislodging the king away and then capturing the queen on d8 next move. So this is one I've seen a lot, knight to g8. Another one is the move queen to e7, and here we'll follow a very famous game played by Emanuel Lasco with the white pieces, which followed queen to e2, knight to g8, knight to f3, pawn to d6, which is actually a big mistake here for black because white is already winning after the move knight to d5, and in fact this position has been reached a number of times already. And here black played the move queen to d8 in the game, and white has a number of different wins. Played the move pawn takes d6, bishop to e6, knight takes c7, king to d7. Now the game continued, knight e5 check. And here if the king takes on d6, then white has the move knight takes bishop, And if king takes, there's all sorts of discoveries such as knight c6, which will pick up the queen on d8. Same goes for pawn takes, there's a fork on f7. So the game continued king to c8 instead, after which white played the move knight takes bishop, pawn takes, and here white has a very pretty checkmate in a couple of moves. See if you can spot the winning tactic here for white. Pause the video if you need to. So the very pretty finish to this game continued queen to c4 check, knight c6, and now we have the big sacrifice, which is queen takes on c6, pawn takes, bishop a6 check, king goes to b8, and knight takes c6 is a very nice checkmate. So this is a line mainly seen in the lower levels, but something you should definitely keep in mind because it might win you a couple of very nice games. So next we're going to go into slightly more critical lines, so I'll catch you then. So now we'll get to the most critical test for white in this variation, and that's after f4, black countering with the move pawn to d5 in the center. So after this we're going to take on e5, knight takes e4, and there's a couple of options for white including d3, knight f3, but I'm going to recommend the most trendiest line as well as the most popular one, which most players with black side may not have seen before, and that is the move queen to f3 here. So after the move queen f3, a couple of moves for black have been seen. One is the move knight to c6, after which I recommend bishop to b5, knight takes, pawn takes, queen h4 check, g3. Black wants to get into this endgame after queen takes, pawn takes, and here white has a couple of options. You can play the move bishop f4 and delay the capture, or you can just capture the knight right away. After pawn recaptures, play the move bishop to e3 to stop bishop c5, bishop e7, knight e2, castles, and for example knight d4. Now we've given up our bishop pair, but we've given black these double pawns on the queen side. Also, these two pawns in the center are weak for both players, but in practice it's shown that these light square weaknesses aren't so bad for white, and also these pawns, it seems to be a little bit more difficult for black to capture the e5 pawn than what you would initially think, and this e4 pawn can also become a target very, very quickly. For example, one variation might continue bishop to d7, castles queenside, pawn to a5, and after rook to e1 already we see this pawn is going to come under some attack, and white also has some opportunity of sacrificing with the move pawn to e6 here and giving black even more damaged pawn structure in return. So I believe that white is totally fine in this variation. Another option after the move queen to f3 is knight takes c3. So this is very popular, especially at a higher level. After the move d takes, black has two main options. One is c5, bishop f4, knight c6 castles, bishop e6, bishop c4 was played in one game, knight e7, and already here after the move bishop to b5, knight back to c6, and pawn to c4, we see that a 2700 Grandmaster here as black was already in a lot of trouble and has to think about how he's going to sacrifice either his d pawn or perhaps his b pawn. After the move 6 bishop to e6, then we can play the move queen to g3. So queen g3 is the whole point of this queen f3 line. We're trying to put pressure on this g7 pawn so black can't develop this bishop very easily, and in general this is a very important attacking theme which you should keep in mind in similar structures. Here one game continued, knight to c6, and after knight f3, queen d7, white has many options. Bishop b5 has been played, a6, bishop takes, queen takes, knight d4, queen back to d7, and castles kingside. Black can't castle kingside very easily because of the queen, therefore black may decide to castle queenside. However, now white has a very straightforward plan of just marching our pawns on the queen side and trying to develop some sort of queenside attack there. So instead of 7 knight c6, another game continued c5, and after bishop b5 check, of course you don't have to go bishop b5 check, but I think white's reasoning is that if the bishop goes to d3, then it might get kicked out by some c4 move at some point in the game, or perhaps he just wanted to damage black's pawn structure after this capture. We see that black is probably not going to castle his king to the queen side anytime soon, and he's still having some problems developing his bishop on the king side. So this is my recommendation, but the most troubling line for me in terms of this queen f3 one from the black side is actually to play the move pawn to f5, which is my recommendation as black here against queen f3 in one of my previous videos against the Vienna. And after the move pawn to d3, which I think is the best, knight takes, pawn takes, black has this very nice pawn to d4 move. Now if we could have played pawn to d4, our pawn on e5 would be perfectly safe, but here we're under a little bit of pressure. So I believe we should continue with queen g3 again to stop this bishop from developing. But after the move knight to c6, we have to be very, very accurate here in our moves. So I suggest we start with the move bishop to e2. So preparing bishop to f3, possible checks even with bishop h5. So bishop e6 to stop any possible checks. And after the move pawn to c4, which is actually the computer's recommendation in this position, we receive a very odd position. For example, after the move bishop to b4 check, we already have to play the move king to d1, castles, and knight h3. This has not been played very often to my knowledge, and the reason is probably because our king is stuck on d1 and it may not be any clear plan. But objectively, the engine still thinks that white is completely equal, and this most likely has to do with the fact that the pawn structure in the center is very closed, so it's hard for black to actually make use of the fact that our king is stuck in this manner. And we still can continue with the move rook to b1, the knight is jumping into d squares, and it's really hard to tell who is better in this position. So this one definitely maybe looks playable for white, but definitely a little bit risky. So another option instead is to perhaps play the move bishop to f3. Here black should take the pawn on c3. If he doesn't take the pawn on c3, then we might end up playing the same move anyway. But after the move pawn takes c3, white can consider this capture on c6 with bishop takes c6. This is in order to stop queen d7, which would allow black to probably safely castle to the queen side without too much difficulty. So this at least damages the pawn structure, and then after knight e2, queen d7, perhaps we can castle, and bishop to e7. So don't fall for the trap here of going queen takes on g7 and losing your queen to bishop c5 check. Instead, what we should do is continue with bishop to g5. So if we can trade off these dark squared bishops, then we can perhaps win this c pawn and then create some sort of dark square blockade playing against this light squared bishop, which can't really move. So after castles, bishop takes, for example, queen takes, then something like queen to e3, and objectively I still think white is doing perfectly fine, and black is probably still okay as well in these types of structures even after the capture on c6. So both players are doing okay, but white has some decent chances here. After you win the pawn back, you do have this passed pawn, and you can also play against the possibly a bad bishop depending on where the pawns end up on. So instead of 2 knight f6, black can also play the move knight c6, and here I'm recommending the move bishop to c4, and there are a bunch of different traps here which black can fall into if he plays the move bishop to c5 here. starting with the move queen to g4. The immediate idea is that we're hitting this pawn on g7, and there's no discoveries for black, unfortunately, after the moves such as d5, because queen takes g7 is just winning the rook in the corner. Therefore, if black can't play d5, the only other logical moves are g6 and queen f6. If g6, we play the move queen to f3, and for example, queen f6 is met by knight to d5, hitting c7. A trade of queens would give white a slightly preferred position here, since again this black bishop is somewhat misplaced from its fianchetto square. If instead on move 5 knight f6 is played, then we continue with knight e2, pawn to d3. The queen can always slide across to g3 when it's being attacked, and the bishop will come out to g5, and we see the same problem, that this bishop on c5 is somewhat misplaced, and black has all these dark squared holes on the king side he has to deal with. So instead, queen f6 is usually the preferred move, but this runs into another trap after the move knight to d5, which is very unexpected if your opponent has not seen this before, since they may think that you might have to defend the pawn on f2. Instead, we're attacking the queen, attacking c7 square, and if queen takes f2 here, we simply play the move king to d1, and we see the problem is that the black queen is really short on squares. We're still attacking c7 and g7, so the most logical move is king to f8, and after the move knight h3, black has a couple of options here. If he wants to move the queen, he only has one square. He does have the move pawn to h5 though, which is one of the better options, and after the move queen g5, try to play the move queen d4. But again, after the move pawn to d3, he runs into this problem of pawn to c3, and the queen is trapped in the middle of the board. If after knight h3 he immediately goes queen d4, then we do the same thing after the move pawn to d3, and we're threatening again both c3 and even bishop e3 here to perhaps win the bishop on c5 is an option. Moves such as d6 don't really help, because after the queen drops back, bishop takes knight. If we capture the bishop here, then the queen may have a square on f2 to escape to, but instead white can just play the move rook to f1, threatening a counter checkmate on f7, and after bishop to e6, again c3. So we're always getting this pawn to c3 move, trapping this queen on d4. Knight f6, for example, knight takes f6, pawn takes, and this time we're going to go for bishop h6 check, king e7 and queen g7, hitting the rook and hitting f7 with a serious mating attack here. So this is a fairly common trap now. Most people will probably know it, but there will be some people who may not have seen it before, and you may catch them off guard. So it's definitely worth a shot, and it fits in well with our repertoire. So hope you enjoyed this trap, and next we'll move on to the move knight to f6. Okay, so now we're moving into knight f6 and knight c6 option for black. Pawn goes to d3 in this position. So black has two options. One is knight a5, or one is bishop c5 type of positions. So we're going to start with the move bishop to c5. If black doesn't play bishop c5 and plays something such as d6, then without the bishop pressuring us on c5, you probably can just continue with the move pawn to f4 here and develop your knight to f3, castle, maybe look to play the move pawn to f5 and get some sort of kingside attack going. But with the bishop on c5, it's a lot more dangerous to play f4. It can still be played, but I'm going to recommend the move bishop to g5 instead. So after bishop g5, if black plays the move d6 and just ignores this pin, then knight d5 can be very strong. Bishop e6, and we can start by just giving black these double pawns. Maybe play the move pawn to c3. Let's say f5 for black. If he doesn't play f5, then queen f3 or queen h5 is going to put him in a bind. So f5, let's say captures, b4, a4 going for the bishop, and maybe something such as queen f3, bishop g6, h4, looking to play h5, and perhaps follow h5 with knight h3 to g5. Gives white a very pleasant position here and a decent attacking chances. So after bishop g5, h6 is commonly played in order to break this pin with pawn to g5. And here I'm recommending bishop h4, d6. And now instead of bringing the knight to f3 as most people would do in this position, which would be, I believe, pretty bad, because after g5 our bishop is stuck on a very bad square on g3. Instead, we're recommending knight to a4, which is an old line played by Larsen, and also popularized by an Australian Grandmaster, Ian Rogers. After knight a4, bishop to b6. We'll see the idea is to take this bishop off the board and then play this move pawn to f3, just to give our dark squared bishop a retreat square on f2 if we need it. And here I'll give you two examples. One, continued knight to a5. We should always let this bishop be captured on the c4 square in order to gain some more control over the center. So here we should play the move knight to e2. And after captures, bishop to e6, pawn goes to b3. We see this very nice pawn chain all on the white squares, our bishop being on the opposite color, and we see that white has full control over this major pawn break of d5 in the center. So we see the f5 pawn break was played by black, but it's not as effective. And black here mainly has the problem of what to do with the king. So if the king goes kingside, we see that these pawns have been far advanced, so it's always going to be a little bit weak there. Whereas if the king goes queenside, he runs into another problem, and that is white would just start an automatic attack with knight to b5 and a4, a5. And it's very hard to stop something like this from happening. Therefore, black played the move knight to h4. So Ian played the move knight to b5 in this position with white, which is a very nice idea. So this knight can't be easily removed from this b5 square, since any pawn push will result in the d6 pawn being lost. And knight takes g2 here is not good because bishop takes b6. And after bishop takes b6, we see black is in a lot of trouble. If we capture here, we capture on d6, we check, followed by recapturing the knight on g2. So instead, after this, rook d8 was played, but we see the problem where to put the king for black. White simply captures and plays the move pawn to f4, blasting open the center, and we see the black king is not in the right spot to deal with it. And white went on to win a nice game. Another game continued queen to e7 here, and after knight e2, bishop to e6, knight to c3 was played, knight a5. So after knight a5, most people would drop the bishop back to the b3 square, but again Ian tries to keep with our plan by playing the move pawn to b3. In order to wait for the capture on c4, we capture back with the d pawn, and again we get this pawn structure with white, and this is the goal. So g5, bishop f2, knight h5, queen goes to d2, bishop e3. Again, white's plan is very simple, very easy to play. g3 was played by white, queen h7. Again, we see this knight b5 move played by Ian. And after queen e7, this time queen b4 was played, castles, h4, immediately going for a kingside attack, because we see that these pawns are definitely a target. King g7, rook h2, g4. So black is trying to close lines instead of allowing white to just double and then capture on g5. Queen d2 was played, attacking h6, h5. Now we have f4. Captures with the g pawn to open up the g file for the rooks. Maybe play f5 one day. And here white played the move e5, so taking advantage of this pin along the file, and already we see that white has a clearly winning position after captures. We'll see the rest of the game didn't last much longer. And here we see a nice fork coming after knight to e8. Ian brings the knight into this e6, f6 square, hitting all of black's major pieces. A very nice way to finish the game off. So black resigned in this position. This is a very simple plan, but I find this very effective plan, which not many people know about. So next we'll go to the most critical line for black, and what I think to be the best response against our Vienna. So the last variation we have is what I consider to be the most critical test for us playing the Vienna, and that's after bishop c4, knight f6, d3, and black plays immediately this move, knight to a5, going for our light squared bishop. And here there are two ways you can play, and I've tested both of them out, and I believe that one of them is probably a little bit easier than the other one. The first one is to go knight to e2, and after knight takes, pawn takes, bishop c4, castles, d6 for example, our structure is to put the queen on d3, our pawn will go to b3, our pawn will go to probably a4, our knight will go to g3 to stop any f5 pawn advance, and then maybe we'll put our bishop on e3 and play from there. Generally, I find that this structure is very solid for white. It's very hard for black to sort of make any breakthroughs, but at the same time I find it's very difficult for white to progress our position forward, since if we play any sort of f4 pawn advance in the future, black can always gain the e5 square to put his knight, maybe play against our weakened e pawn, and also maybe just stop us with the move pawn to f6 later. He also has the bishop pair and decent prospects if we try to open the position too much. However, you can play this position if you're willing to sort of just maneuver your pieces around and happy with some sort of equal middle game. Another plan you could try is one which Nakamura played against Magnus, and that's to sort of put the knight into the d5 square when you have the opportunity. The idea being that in order to get rid of this knight, black will have to either exchange it off, which allows us to undouble our pawns in some cases, or to chase it off with the pawn going to c6, after which we just retreat, and all of a sudden we have a target on d6 which we can attack. And that's exactly what Hikaru did in this game, by just piling on and putting pressure on this d6 pawn, going on to win a very nice blitz game. However, what I think to be a lot easier variation to play, in my opinion, after knight a5 is to drop the bishop back to b3. After bishop b3, for example, let's say bishop to b4 here, we can play the move knight to f3. Knight e2 is also a playable move, but I like knight f3, and after captures d6, d5 has also been played in this position before by some top grandmasters, and the game continued. Pawn takes, knight takes, bishop d2, knight takes, bishop takes. Got some exchanges here, and in the following position d4 was played by white, and Repertoire went on to win a very nice game against Levon Aronian in this position. After the move pawn to d6 instead, then white can just play the move pawn to h3, and again position is roughly equal, but it's definitely one which white can play on. Perhaps later on try to go for d4 and get some pawn break going in the center, perhaps going for the dark squared bishop and playing an opposite color bishop middle game again. If instead after bishop b3 black goes for knight takes b3, pawn takes b3, and pawn to d5, this was seen in a very recent game played by Magnus with the black side against the World Championship challenger Nepomniachtchi. And in that game, I believe Nepomniachtchi opted for the immediate pawn takes and some sort of queen h5 move, going for queen takes on e5, but Magnus, I believe, just sacrificed his pawn by playing some knight b4 and went on to show that he got a lot of compensation for this sacrifice pawn, and I tend to agree that black is doing quite well in that position. So instead, I'm going to recommend the move knight to f3. Here black has the option of taking, and we're just going to take back. Instead of taking on e5, which a lot of people have played, I'm just going to recommend pawn takes on e4, and going for this endgame after queen takes, king takes, let's say bishop d6, and king to e2. It's similar to some other queenless middle games we've seen in other positions, where you sort of stick your pawn on c3, your pawn on f3, the king hovers on c2 or e2, and you sort of maneuver with your pieces. So here the idea is that, let's say a6, we play the move knight straight to the d2 square, and the knight's just going to hop into c4. We might put our pawn to the f3 square to stop any possible danger there, and we don't really have to worry about any piece getting to d4 anytime soon. So this knight is very far away from the d4 square, which is very important, and we have time to set up something like this. Maybe this, the bishop can come out to g5 or e3, the rook can come to d1, and I feel that white has decent play in this position, even though it's objectively around about equal position. So that concludes my recommendations for the Vienna. So I'm really liking this opening, and it's especially popular in blitz and rapid time controls. I hope you have a chance to try it out. Any questions, just leave me a comment down below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Take care.